Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Cultural Studies Podcast. My name is Toby Miller, and my guest today is
Eleonora Pasotti, professor at the University of California, Santa Cruz in the politics department.
wonderful to meet you, Prof. Thanks so much for being here. And this is the first time I've discussed Italian politics to the extent we do that in detail since college, although I read a lot about it. But we may not focus on it, we'll see. My opening gambit, my opening question that I pose to all guests is to inquire as to what's currently dynamizing, impeding, preoccupying, interesting you.
Okay, let's take that one step at a time. We'll start with dynamiting. I am very excited about my current project, to be honest, also because I am leaving in 3 days for fieldwork and interviews, the first round of interviews. And so I am in the middle of packing up and organizing, and so that is highly, highly dynamiting. The project that I'm working on is about the politics behind the so-called loneliness epidemic. This has been a topic that has been in the news and in the media quite a bit in recent years. And my goal is to try to understand what debates and what policy initiatives are taking place in Europe on this subject, so that I can bring them back and they can offer food for thought for us in the United States.
And where in Europe will you be traveling? Where will you be investigating these things?
So the project investigates this issue in 6 sites. They are 3 paired comparisons. The paired comparisons are based on whether on the degree of government involvement in addressing this issue. So the first pair of cases is London and Amsterdam, which are 2 cities that are set in countries where the national government has been extremely proactive in this issue. In fact, in both countries, starting 2018, we have national level policies. In the UK, we have the first so-called national minister for loneliness. It was in a formal minister, but it was a ministerial line, which is, in terms of financing, since it is a committed line long-term, a very important step to be taken. And so the first 2 cities, the first 2 sites, London and Amsterdam, are cities in which policy is to alleviate loneliness is developed in the context of very strong government input. The second pair of cities is Helsinki and Barcelona, 2 very different cities, but that are highlighted in the literature as being the 2 cities in Europe that have, absent a strong government program, undertaken the most extensive, effective, generous programs at the municipal level to alleviate loneliness. Very different programs, fascinatingly different programs, as can be expected, given that one city is Helsinki and the other city is Barcelona. The third paired comparison is 2 cities in which we observe neither national government intervention, nor really strong municipal policies, and where loneliness alleviation has been undertaken through grassroots initiatives. And these, I think, are the 2 most prominent, most interesting grassroots initiatives in Europe. One is in my hometown of Bologna, and a very early player in this field, with a group that was founded in 2013. And in the other city is Paris, which has Hypervoisin, a very by now famous group that started just a few years after Bologna.
I don't know why this is happening. Perhaps it's because I'm living in Mexico, but I immediately think of Protestantism versus Catholicism. I think of Protestantism as being a prime site of anomic individualism, and Catholicism as a prime site of collectivism. Now, obviously,
Well,
these are wild generalizations, but
I find loneliness a very interesting topic because it raises a lot of doubts in assumptions that we used to have. And even in this case, it does. Methodologically, it's very important to distinguish loneliness from social isolation. Loneliness is the unpleasant feeling that we have because we aspire to have either more or deeper social connections or emotional connections, right? There are different types of different levels at which loneliness can manifest. It can be, I wish I had more acquaintances or a wider social circle, or it can be, I wish I had deeper emotional ties with my family and so on, right? Social isolation is purely the presence or lack of social linkages. Now, the distinction is very important for two reasons. The first one is methodological, because social isolation we can measure by simply counting the number of social connection that an individual has. It is a relatively simple measure and less problematic than measuring loneliness, which instead requires a psychological assessment, some kind of inquiry that goes into the psychological state of the individual, of the respondent. So much trickier to really get data on loneliness. Even more important, and here it comes to address directly your question, Toby, is the fact that contrary to what we might think, one might live in a collectivist society and still feel very lonely. Or one might live in a society that has no problem with, and in fact, as a culture of even heralding the social isolation and the self-reliance that is associated with social isolation, and thereby individuals not feeling lonely. And that is precisely what we find. The first measure of loneliness at the European comparative level is a study funded and executed in 2018, which finds, Toby, precisely that. We have higher levels of social isolation in Nordic countries, but lower loneliness, and we have lower levels of social isolation in southern countries, southern European countries, but higher levels of reported loneliness. And so this raises the question, where you are in Mexico, it is well possible, I have no doubt, that the culture is collective, but that doesn't mean that people are less affected by loneliness.
my next question is about how you go about these things. Because I work in the Global South, I have very limited access to your publications, and I don't have access to your books. But I am able to read out the title of a prize you won, which must be the longest title, apart from, Charles III's full name, I think I've ever read. Your book, Resisting Redevelopment, Protest in Aspiring Global Cities, won the American Sociological Association section on collective behavior and social movements, Charles Tilley Distinguished Contribution to Scholarship Book Award. It's an absolutely wonderful title. And one of the things you do there is to compare cities really in almost all parts of the world. So I wonder how you manage to do that and how you will go about the new project. Do you go into the middle of town with a big sign on saying, "Are you lonely?" And everyone thinks you're a Scientologist, and so they do. And you say, here, take this IQ test. What do you do, Prof, to make this happen? Do you know what I mean?
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. But I've written two books. This is the third one, and methodologically they're quite similar, although the topics are incredibly different. Um, my work has always been urban transregional. In fact, my first book was one of the very first to launch a literature on urban transregional comparisons in political science. We now have in the American political science field, we have a very flourishing, very lively comparative urban politics field. But when I wrote my first book in 2009, that was extremely limited. The first book was a comparison of Naples, Bogota, and Chicago. So very, very different cities. And in that case, I was looking at mayoral politics. I'm happy to go into it if you like. It was a very, very fun book with a lot of really neat stories. And so if you like, we can go into it. I loved doing working on that book. Part of the lesson that was coming out of that book was that mayors in the neoliberal age have gained a lot of prominence, visibility, authority, even to the point that in the cities that I was observing, despite the fact that they were so different, far away from each other, you had very strong parallels in observing city councils that were really disempowered. Very powerful mayors, very charismatic mayors who would carry a lot of political clout, who would be reelected with landslides. And where was the opposition? And that left me wondering, wait a moment, in this political landscape, which we can expand, but for the time being, to look for a label, let's just call it the neoliberal urban political landscape. What form does opposition take? If these mayors are so effective at creating charismatic brands that carry so much political clout, the book was called Political Branding in Cities, what form can opposition take? What I was observing was opposition profoundly disempowered, and that left me curious. So the second book looked at. I was curious about that, and I had a friend and a colleague, Terry Clark from the University of Chicago, who told me, maybe offhand, but I listened to him very carefully, and so I took him seriously. Maybe he didn't really mean it, but he trapped me into this ambition of the second book. He said, oh, for your second book, you should do a lot more cities than you did for your first book. And I thought, okay, let's go ahead. And while the first book was relatively simple, you asked the methodological question, how do I go about? Well, in the first city, in all of my books, what I do is I first do all of the archival research that I possibly can. And I get drafts of basically the entire book based on a very first draft, based on archival research. Once I have the archival research in place, I formulate a tentative argument. I have a very inductive approach because I tend to write on things where there isn't much literature to confront. So I sit down, I write a tentative argument, and then I, very open-ended still, go to the field and do interviews. My methodology is not based on surveys, it's based on interviews. And so for the first book, I was interviewing all the mayors around the period that I was interested in, and before and after, and all of the staff that worked for them, including also scholars, but primarily these political elites. For the second book, I was interested in protest. And so again, I did all of the archival research that I could. I wrote down the 29 cases that are the subject of the book. And then I went to the field for all cities. This was set in 10 cities. I went to the field for all cities except the English-speaking cities, which were the last ones. And by then I felt, number one, I was really running out of time because it took a decade to write the second book. And number two, I felt that the language would help, and we could have remote interviews. And I was familiar with the sites, the topological. I had been to the places. I was familiar with the landscapes, the physical landscapes, because this was about displacement and gentrification. So it really required having a sense of the space and the neighborhoods and the feeling and the vibes. I was familiar with that. I conducted the interviews for the last 3 cases, the English-speaking cases, online. Otherwise, for 7 cities, I actually did field work. And this is the same approach that I have also in this book, which is, as I mentioned, 6 cities. I am doing all of the archival work prior, and now I'm going to the field with already 100,000 words draft written for the book, and ready to go redline it all if I hear otherwise in the field, but with a pretty precise idea about at least what archive and media are reporting about and documents, government documents are reporting about the phenomenon. That allows the field experience to be a lot more focused, because again, I will be engaging in interviews. In this case, so in the second book, it was with organizers. In this case, it was going to be with political actors who devised these policies, and with organizers of, NGO leaders that are active in this field. It allows for my interviews to be a lot more focused. I have a sense of what specific, the interview starts open-ended, but also has a sense of what theoretical issues I'm particularly interested in delving in. And so that makes it for efficient. There is something more to be said, I think, about the approach. Interviews are extremely interesting. They're stimulating. People come alive. You get surprises. You get beautiful stories. You get the human contact. That's where the book comes alive. However, people might not remember precisely, and people might have, some post hoc message that in the meantime they seek to deliver. Relying on archival research prior allows me to ground my baseline in what was effectively said and done, at least as pertains the record at the time. And I'll give you an example. Not only is this helpful in the case of newspaper articles and government documents, but even in terms of what these people have said. So, for example, Facebook or social media threads. By doing archival research, I'm able to look at what was said at the time, what was the opposition at the time, what was the discussion at the time. And that often makes interviews then very interesting, because they might be, a year or 2 years after the fact. And I can say, well, I mean, I wrote, I read in that exchange, that public exchange or that Facebook exchange, that's the way the issue was presented. How do you feel about it today? Or can you tell me more about that event? You see, it gives me a really solid baseline, and it grounds the interview more, I think, in facts. Also, with facts, with tools like Google Maps, this was really important for the second book, because there were 10 cities, 29 campaigns of residential displacement, which often meant a neighborhood where there is a dispute over the use of space and zoning, and what buildings should stand and what buildings should come down over time. Well, I obviously couldn't be in all places at once. And in fact, by the time I would come to the story, very often, the buildings would have been turned down, right? Or, battles that would have been so-called quote unquote won or lost. I was coming to the issues after the fact. Well, tools like Google Earth would allow me to go back and observe the same neighborhood, the same block, the same locality at different points in time, which was fabulous because that way I could get screenshot photos of protests. For example, in Seoul, of protesters occupying the buildings I was interested in with the police outside. While in fact, by the time I went to Seoul, the buildings were no longer there. And the interviews were fabulous. But in terms of visuals, I no longer had access to direct evidence of what I was discussing.
So I can see some links across the three projects. In the first one, in a sense, it's relatively straightforward. You've got a public figure, the mayor, in these cities that you want to understand in terms of the circulation of discourses about them and their use of machine politics or their non-use of machine politics. And perhaps we could talk about that book in a moment. In the second one, you've got social movements that make quite a lot of noise and produce quite a lot of words that can be read, right? So again, there's lots of discourse. In the third one, you've got both state actors and third sector actors, but you're also delving into something that is much more personal for everybody.
Well, yes, but you are really an excellent interviewer, I must say, because yes, even in the third one, my primary interest is not on the people affected by loneliness. My primary interest is in how politicians and third sector leaders construct the idea of loneliness, whether it is constructed as a problem, whether it's constructed not as a problem, and if it is a problem, on what basis is it a problem? Is it a problem, for example, because it's very expensive, as we observe in some settings, among which the US, the motivation to alleviate loneliness is that it is a very expensive problem for public health, for productivity, for GDP, with measures to go along with that. In other settings, the motivation to alleviate loneliness is based on solidarity. We want a happy society. We don't want people who are unhappy. And so to the extent that loneliness is something that makes people unhappy, we want to intervene. And there is no debate, there's no discussion about the cost, the financial cost of loneliness. So very different approaches. Also, what I'm observing when I look at the 6 cases is who is the target of these policies? In some cases, there is an emphasis on targeting specific groups. So a very communitarian, if you want, approach to the issue. In other cases, loneliness is addressed as a very broad social feature, and so social issue, and so class might emerge as a factor, but not communal features, not communities per se are addressed as targets. And so the variation on both of these factors, that is to say, the motivation for intervention and how do we understand the recipients, the targets of loneliness alleviation policies, is what is animating me, and as you say, what is dynamiting me right now.
So going back to the first book, Political Branding in Cities, The Decline of Machine Politics in Bogota, Naples, and Chicago. This is really interesting. This is the notion of branding displacing machinery. Of course, these are 3 cities notorious for collective violence. The mafia in the case of Naples and Chicago, and people who call themselves the mafia in the case of Bogota. But in the case of Bogota, it is overtly, capital P, political violence too. They're quite different in terms of size. Naples is nothing. Bogota is immense. Chicago, I guess, somewhere in between. And in the United States, Chicago is probably still known as a machine politics place. It's thought of, I would say, still as bare knuckle Democratic Party feuding. So, could you tell me why I'm wrong? Tell me more about the book and tell us if anything's changed because it came out more than 15 years ago.
Yes. So the cities are different in terms of population size, in terms, of course, the region. There are many differences. But the reason why I chose these three cities is because, as you mentioned, for Chicago, they are identified by scholars within their own continent as the leading example of machine politics. If anybody was to talk about the leading example of machine politics in Europe, on which there is a very beautiful and rich literature, people would say Naples. Okay, just like in the U.S. context, Chicago comes, and then in the South American context, there is a very broad literature on clientelism, but Bogota certainly has a very plays a very important role. I mean, one could look at Buenos Aires, but Bogota in itself is a very important city. And what was fascinating for me at the time of writing the book, which started only on Naples as my PhD dissertation. The PhD dissertation was about Naples. And the motivation for the PhD dissertation, and here we have to go back a very long time, was 1993 Putnam, Making Democracy Work. In Making Democracy Work, Robert Putnam really shook political science, sociology by bringing back Tocqueville and arguing that the good governance was very path dependent and was driven by and was quite deterministic, to be frank. In other words, he explained the good governance that we observed, that he observed with extraordinary data in and long-standing, enduring good governance in northern Italy, and the bad governance that he and his co-authors in that book witnessed in southern Italy. He explained it going back to the Middle Ages. Now, he was basing his analysis on a laboratory, quasi-laboratory setting. That is to say, he was looking at the impact of the introduction of regions in the 1970s in Italy. And the idea was, look, it's in the 1970s, this new level of government is introduced all across Italy. And now, 10 years later, 15 years later, 20 years later, we're going to go and measure the impact of these new regional governments. And he finds, oh, look, in the regions that have centuries of good governance, these regional governments do well. And in the cities that have centuries of bad government, these new forms of government do poorly. Now, what was interesting for me at the time of writing the dissertation is that in 1991, we have a new quasi-laboratory condition in Italy, the introduction of direct mayoral elections. And the impact is exactly the opposite. We have, throughout the 90s, Southern mayors that are recognized as extremely charismatic, loved, admired, re-elected by a landslide, transformative, and Northern mayors who appear bland, ineffective, and alienate citizenry. And so that was the motivation for the dissertation, right? And it brought me to Naples for the very first time in my life. I come from Northern Italy. It was a very interesting and complex, I shall say, cultural experience in itself, full of fabulous stories, to explore this new mayor who was the most loved mayor in Italy. very transformative mayor and a very charismatic mayor, a mayor that abandoned clientelism for a variety of reasons and shifted towards instead creating political clout by relating directly to citizens, no longer mediated by clients, by building brands, what I call a political brand. And what was interesting was that then, as I was writing the book, turning the dissertation into the book, I observed the precise same phenomenon taking place also in two other classic clientelism cities, Chicago and Bogota. It was, Toby, so fascinating to observe both the electoral speeches as well as the speeches that these mayors would make once elected, and even the policies that these mayors privileged, that if you took away the name of the mayor or the name of the city, you would not know, and just looked at the quotes, trust me, you would not know which city you were, and despite the fact that these cities are so different. So theoretically, the story was very powerful. I should add the caveat that the shift to brand politics is specific to mayoral elections. The council level elections maintained machine politics. I just want to make sure on the record for these readers. You asked me about the impact. I have to be honest, and the three cities, first of all, the three cities that I examined in the first book are not part of the second book, nor the third book. I have this extremely inefficient curiosity that makes me jump site over and over. And so I don't have the same level of expertise for the period after the book that I had during the book. My impression, however, is twofold. One, the policies, the changes that these mayors made to the political system are somewhat a bit enduring, but not very much. Differently enduring, I should say. What I mean to say is that at some level, the notion of political branding as the strategically dominant strategy to win mayoral elections under current modalities is still there. You no longer win a mayoral election based on clientelism, and that is just a fact based on fiscal retrenchment, and therefore in all of these three cities there is less money to go around to pay off individuals for mayoral elections, higher levels of efficiency for mass communication, and overall a decline in the ideological grip that political parties exercise in most of these in these cases, right? So these three factors together mean that overall, if you want to be a candidate for mayor, the strategy is by and large what I described in the book. In the book, I do highlight also extremely transformative mayors. Now, that part, there was, I believe, some retrenchment, above all in the case of Bogota. And this is quite specific because the case of Bogota, the mayors that I am analyzing for Bogota were Mayor Peñalosa and Mayor Antanas Mocus. These are two extraordinary individuals who had a very specific approach to policy and politics, Antanas Mocus above all, absent him, it is very, very hard to replicate the kind of approach and policy making that we observed under his tenure.
It's a very Weberian typology, isn't it, when you look through these different forms of authority. Speaking of different kinds of authority and the role of charisma, I had a last question for you, Prof. And once you've answered it, please feel free then to add anything you want. And that addition could take the form of covering terrain we've already traversed, or it might be something entirely new. Does that sound okay as a means of slowly bringing us to a conclusion?
Absolutely, love to.
So my last question before opening it up to whatever you want is to ask you about perhaps the most famous person ever to be a singer on cruise ships.
A senior
A
on cruise,
singer. La
a
la la.
singer. Oh, I think I know who you're talking about.
Who might that be? Maybe once owned AC Milan,
Yes,
maybe often Italian prime minister,
yes,
maybe strange variation in shoe size and elevation,
yes.
hair.
Many things we could say about this individual,
Who is
some
this
better
person?
off, better left off. You're
What
talking about
is
Silvio Berlusconi.
exactly? And in your co-edited book about Italian politics, going back to just after your first monograph, I was able to download the introduction. And you're wondering, you and your co-author, co-editor as well, whether you can draw a line under Berlusconi. And of course, the answer, which you knew perfectly well, is that you could never do it until he was dead, and probably not even then.
Not
Oh,
even after his death. Talk about longevity.
right. So here he is, a little guy, balding, being a singer on a cruise ship, who becomes the dominant force in media policy, the media, and eventually politics in Italy as he moves across the political spectrum. But does he ever really move? Discuss. Silvio,
So
Silvio,
I
Silvio.
I love that we're ending here because it's a perfect way to close and reconnect with the opening, your opening. In your opening, you said, oh, this is the most I have talked on this podcast about Italian politics. And my thought immediately was, oh, I encourage you to talk more about Italian politics. The reason why is that Italy, for some reason that is not completely clear to me, is actually appears to be now for many decades has been in the front, in the theoretical front line of political developments. Of course, we have with Italy, I mean, starting with the rise of Mussolini, Italy, even in that case, shows forms of authoritarian and regime that, you know, important lessons that were to be followed. But really, primarily, people look at Berlusconi. I can tell you that yes, in political science, we often, comparativists have often looked at Italy as a precursor, the first place where you observe a certain phenomenon. And as I said, in the case of Berlusconi, that is certainly the case, I think. It's a very prescient, important precedent that informs so much of what we have observed since then in that type of populist leadership, whether we look at your other cases in Europe, such as Orban in Hungary or other leaders, or also elsewhere.
Sorry, where would the elsewhere be the man with the orange head?
Well, some people might make that connection. Some, I think some have made that connection. And also South America, right? In many, many settings. This is really, Berlusconi was the avant-garde. His use of the media to connect to voters. His development of an extremely slender party that was truly and deeply a personal party, a political machine created very quickly, based on personal loyalty, manned by individuals who had largely no political careers, nor known for specific ideology, and yet extraordinarily effective at mobilizing consensus and winning seats. And then the way he governed also, the way he connected to citizens, the kind of policies that he pursued. There's definitely, and the longevity, the enduring, I mean, the extraordinarily longevity of the project, which is hard to understand given the paucity of ideas. Or at least apparent paucity of ideas, certainly the lack of clear ideology. Right? Definitely a very new phenomenon for the post-World War political environment. I would like to conclude my answer to this question with a silver lining.
Something nice about little Silvio.
That is a little hard. But an implication, the damage done. The reason why I think it is very important to study Italy today, and this is unfortunately not the object of my work, but I hope other people are working on this, and I think it's very important, is that somehow, for some reason, the erosion that we observe under Silvio Berlusconi is not as severe as that observed in other contexts with populist leaders. And by erosion, I mean erosion in a very broad sense, rising inequality, in income inequality, erosion of the value of the media, the respect for the media, erosion in public trust, and erosion in the ability of institutions to work, erosion in the quality of consolidated democracy. Despite an extraordinarily long tenure from 1994, if I remember correctly, if not 1992, 1992 perhaps, actually, for most, for 20 years. Note that it is 20 years where if you average the GDP growth of Italy during Berlusconi's tenure, it is the worst in the world at the time, second only to Zimbabwe. So we're talking about, if economics talks, we're talking about a truly surreal economic performance. And yet, the institutional damage is not as severe as the one that we observe in other cases. And I will add more. Italy has been now for a few years led by a far-right government.
Giorgia Meloni.
Yes, Giorgia Meloni, a person and a party that by lineage has, in this case, yes, an ideology, and an ideology that is extremely rooted not only in xenophobia, but also in fascism and monarchism. I mean, extremely right-wing. And yet again, somehow, institutions in Italy are comparatively holding. And that is the question I think that we should be looking at. What is it about institutions, culture, media landscape? What is it about Italy that is allowing the system to hold up despite the fact that it is being led by a far-right government that is a coalition of far-right parties?
But Meloni, unlike Orban or the Orange Head, is smart. She's not just cunning, she's intelligent. And she understands that she has to get on with France and Germany. She understands that although Italy contributes a lot to the EU, it gets a lot from the EU. And she's prepared to listen to what the big boys on the block say. It's a huge difference between her and a lot of these other guys.
As a political scientist, we are uneasy with ascribing so much of the explanatory result on individual charisma and or abilities. And we tend to look for the institutional features that explain the outcomes. Um, in this country, for several years, we had pundits and scholars who said that there could be no erosion of the quality of democracy because of the strength of our institutions and the checks and balances in place. Now, a lot of scholars have raised questions about that. I can think, for example, of the work of Daniel Ziblatt and Stephen Levitsky on how democracies die. And I don't think it is useful to concentrate on individuals as we're trying to find the answers to these questions. I think it is the answer will be more enduring by looking at institutional, systemic differences. Now, what they are, I don't know. But I don't think the difference is just in individuals.
Oh, sure. And in case of Trump, it's about different fractions of the US ruling class having different economic interests. And those economic interests of this new fraction of the ruling class being things that can be served via operating in the name of a supposedly disenfranchised white working class. And that's about a whole set of institutions coming together to create a populist discourse that functions on behalf of people who are completely disarticulated from it.
Yes, the difference are many. The systemic, economic, and political differences between the three systems are many. But we have, relative to the European landscape, Italy as among the highest levels of income inequality itself. So, comparatively speaking, income inequality doesn't do all the work here.
Oh, no, of course
And so
not. Of
yeah,
course.
so I'm still curious about what are the factors that, to observers' surprise, are protecting Italy from going down the Hungary path, which is what people expected. And I don't mean to belittle the changes that have taken place. For example, LGBTQ rights have been undermined, immigrant rights have been undermined. But overall, I think most people would agree that it is to a far lesser extent than was expected when Giorgia Meloni entered government.
And finally, Prof, just a minute or two on anything you'd like to add. As I said, it could be something connected to what we've discussed, or it might be something entirely new. Whatever takes your fancy, Prof.
Mm. I'm better at answering questions this morning uh, than at proposing. Why don't you help me out and ask a question?
Well, here's my question.
Go ahead.
Can you come back to the pod for an episode once you've returned from the field, please?
I would love to. It will be my pleasure. It was a very lovely conversation, and I'm sure I will have a lot to share. I always look forward to being proven very wrong when I go for interviews and discovering much more interesting and articulated stories
Love the
I
idea.
put the emphasis on stories because my books really are about stories, are about what we learn from narratives, and that's my how should I say, tongue-in-cheek way of talking about case studies. So I aspire to come back with very good stories that I will be very looking forward to sharing with you.
Wonderful. See you then. Have a great time.
Thank you very much, Toby. Thank you.